study guide is on evolution. Evolution is on page 75 in your notes. So I do encourage you to, before you watch the video, go to page 75. Reread the notes on evolution first so that as we go over the study guide, it's really making a lot more sense. Before we answer any of the parts of the study guide, we want to first start with defining what evolution is. Evolution is a change in a population over generations. A change in a population over generations. So if I have a bacteria and I spray an antibiotic on it, that bacteria will not evolve. It can't change the genes that it has. However, if one of those bacteria already has a mutation, then it will survive and the population will change as they continue to reproduce. So it's really important that you understand that evolution is a change in the population over generations. We have some really important vocabulary terms to think about here, one of which is the patterns in the fossil record. Now, the most important pattern that you need to be able to recognize is relative dating. We talked about this, like the layers of your laundry basket. The oldest fossils are at the bottom. What this allows you to see are patterns between organisms. So it doesn't tell you exactly how old an organism is or exactly who it's related to. It rather just tells you the patterns as we look back through time. There is something called radioactive dating, and that tells you the exact age. Biochemical comparisons, we want to put a big star by this because the EOC loves to ask you about biochemical comparisons. Biochemical is the most reliable form of evidence for evolution. It's the most reliable because we're just comparing your DNA. And so I just look for how similar is your DNA to another organism. The more similarities, the more likely you are to be related. Next, when we talk about evolution, we also often talk about the role of variation, but we have to know that this is genetic variation. So it doesn't have anything to do with going to the gym and getting really big muscles, or running every day and then you get faster. You can't pass that on to your offspring. And evolution is all about reproducing. So it has to be genetic variations that can be passed on, but genetic variations that also make you best fit for your environment. If I take a saltwater fish, like a flounder, and I put it into freshwater fish, that fish will not be successful there because its adaptations, its genetic traits don't make it fit well into that other environment. So it's important that we know that these variations have to make it successful in that particular environment. We are also expected to know about geographic isolation. Remember, isolation means to be separate, and geographic means to be separate by space. So if you are separated by space, this means that you can't mate, which means you can't reproduce, which means you're not sharing genes in your offspring, which means that you're not going to be able to stay one species. You're going to evolve very separately. So if you can't mate, then speciation or different species happens a lot faster. So we are going to write that this increases speciation because it makes you be so different so much faster. The importance of the environment. What does the environment have to do with natural selection? Charles Darwin traveled all the way to the Galapagos Islands. He noticed each island was different. The environment has selection forces. Selection forces are things in the environment that force selection to happen. This might be something like a predator. It might be something like, remember the moths and the color of the tree bark? The dark moths were not successful on the white tree bark, but when they put them in a different environment, they were successful on the light tree bark. So the environment is really important. It is the selection force. This next set actually takes us back into our early Earth notes. And so in number 1, explain why anaerobic heterotrophic prokaryotes you will most likely be asked about what type of cells were the very first cells. Remember, this was billions of years ago. And they, we said, are P and H, prokaryotic, anaerobic, and heterotrophic. But the question says explain why they had to develop before aerobic eukaryotes. There was something about early Earth that made them have to be anaerobic. Early Earth was missing something, and I'm not going to tell you. You should be able to remember that. What was early Earth missing that meant that they had to be anaerobic? Now, prokaryotic meant they were simple, and that makes sense. They're the smallest, simplest cells would have come first. Now, it does ask you to tell the theory of how organelles evolved. What is it that changed in the environment? Something changed, and then we could have aerobic. So what changed to have aerobic? Look back. What changed to have aerobic? Look back in your notes. There is something very specific. There was the first type of cell, the second type of cell, the third type of cell. Look back at that pattern of evolution. We do need to know the theory of how these complex organelles evolved, and this is called the endosymbiont theory. This is the theory that the mitochondria and the chloroplasts were once living on their own, and they moved in to live together, endosymbiont, and that now they are reliant on each other. If you look at number 2, contrast abiogenesis with biogenesis. Who were the scientists that were involved? Abiogenesis has 3 main parts to this word. A means not, bio means life, and genesis means beginning. This means that the very first cells did not come from other cells. The very first cells came from molecules. And we do need to know that inorganic molecules, now remember, inorganic is things like CO2 and H2O. Inorganic molecules could form organic, things like carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen together, which is carbohydrates and lipids, and they could form proteins. And it was Operin's theory, and Miller and Urey did the experiment, and they proved that the very first cells could have started this way. However, biogenesis is, as I heard a student say today, the idea that life continues. And it continues through the ability of organisms to reproduce. Because we can reproduce sexually or asexually, life does continue. Now, we didn't talk too much about these scientists, but Reddy and Pasteur are the scientists who proved that. They were the ones who took the ratty meat, and they actually proved that the maggots were coming from flies, not just from the thin air. Explain Darwin's theory of natural selection. There are 3, according to this, 4, according to our notes, aspects of it. And so I'm not going to give you these. You need to go back to your notes. The purpose of the study guide, remember, is for you to go back to your notes and read and study your notes, not just to copy it off a video. So go back and make sure that you have looked at the 3 or 4 main points of natural selection. When it says to include an example, I'm going to encourage you to use the moths. Remember, there were 2 selection forces with the moths, both the predator and the changing environment. So I'd encourage you to, when you're done, go back and answer that, or just pause the video as you're watching. Next, we're talking about penicillin and an antibiotic. And so when we look at penicillin, it's an antibiotic that was developed and used in the early part of the 20th century. At first, the antibiotic was very effective in killing the syphilis bacteria. Over time, more and more syphilis bacteria became resistant to penicillin. Explain how this resistance may have developed. The most important thing to know is that there would have been random mutations. The antibiotic did not cause the mutation. There was already random mutations or random variation. And this allowed some to be resistant. Resistant, remember, means that you're not harmed by it. So they weren't harmed by the antibiotic. And these were the ones that survived long enough to reproduce, which meant that as time passed, most of the ones who reproduced, the ones that were reproducing, were the resistant ones. If I had one that wasn't resistant and I applied an antibiotic to it, it would die. It wouldn't mutate and become resistant. Next it has, why does sexual reproduction speed up evolution? And so we do need to know that sexual reproduction is going to give us increased genetic something. And so I'm not going to give you that answer. You should be able to tell me increased genetic what and why is that important. Now, as you're finishing this section of the study guide, you'll notice that there are not graphs of stabilizing, directional, and disruptive selection. So it is really important that you go back and review your notes. You need to be able to recognize those three graphs. They will be on your EOC. You also need to be able to recognize your anatomical evidence. Remember the whale fin and the bat arm and the human arm and the dog leg? Those are what we call homologous structures. They're similar in structure, which means that they came from a common ancestor. So you'll notice that this study guide is missing some parts of evolution, and it's really important that you go back and study your notes. The next section is on classification. So if you have the same notes, then these notes are going to start on page. If you flip, these notes start on page, 89. So I again encourage you to stop the video and go to page 89 and read through your notes. It does ask you for the 7 levels of classification, and so you should know that there's King Philip came over for green soup. And what you'll want to be able to do is go back and tell me these levels. Now keep in mind, domain was just recently added, so we memorized Dear King Philip came over for green soup, domain being the largest groups. Binomial nomenclature, please circle bi and underline nome. Bi, like a bicycle, means two, and nome means name. So this is a two-name naming system. It uses the last two. It uses the G category and the S category. But we do have to write the words correctly. So I'm going to write one incorrectly. Homo sapien. That is written incorrectly. One of them is supposed to be capitalized. One is lowercase. And we do something to the whole entire name. So make sure that as you write this, you write it correctly. You could write it incorrectly and then cross it out. DNA, biochemical analysis, embryology, morphology, how are they used to classify organisms? They find similarities. And they find common ancestors. So they find who is most related and who their common ancestors are. You will, for sure, see a phylogenetic tree on your EOC, so you want to make sure that you know how to read these. Remember, we start at the bottom and we drive our way up. And as they branch off, we see what traits they have. So, for example, ray fin fish. After ray fin fish, please add bones. Ray fin fish do not have bones, so that's why bones is after ray fin fish split off. I have 1 minute to wrap it up. And so when we look at this section, you should be able to see which 3 pairs are most related. Is it the mammal and the bird and the crocodile and the snake? You should be able to look at this tree and see who's most related and who's closely related to the ray fin fish and who's most closely related to mammals. You do need to be able to use a dichotomous key. You will, for sure, see one of these on your EOC. Please write that you need to start with question number 1 and put a big circle around this number